Sorry I can't be there today, but I wanted to take you through this Andrew Jackson PowerPoint. This is our brand new unit on Jackson. Some things you can be expecting to learn about if you take a look up at the I can statements over on the board. We're going to be learning a lot about how Jackson ran the country during his time as president and specifically different things, policies and actions that he approved or wanted that impacted the lives of Native Americans. What's interesting is President Donald Trump has a lot of people who are actually comparing him to Andrew Jackson. So I just wanted to show you a short video clip before we get into everything today. This is a video clip from election night 2016 when Donald Trump won the presidency of the United States. And you're going to hear NBC news anchor Chuck Todd and others comparing Trump to Andrew Jackson. So let's just listen in on this for just a couple of minutes.
Capitol Hill tonight, who are saying things like, well, now he's going to have to learn how to fall in line with Congress.
Oh, yeah?
Does he? Says who? Donald Trump would have something to say about that.
Look, I never thought somebody who may or may not win the popular vote, may not cross 300 electoral votes, I never thought I would say that person has a mandate. But this person has a mandate.
You went to that map lately? That's a lot of red.
Trump has a mandate because of how he won and because it was in defiance of the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the professional intelligentsia in this country, whether it's we in the news media, the academics, you name it. So he owes nothing to those folks. Now, you want to get something done? Okay, that's another story. But he doesn't owe anybody anything. It is a fascinating, I'm trying to think of the last president, Andrea, that didn't owe, sort of political party, didn't owe a lot of fundraisers. He comes in without owing a lot of people much.
Andrew Jackson?
Yeah, exactly. You got to go back to Andrew Jackson. No, and I think this is a modern day Andrew Jackson.
So as you can hear, the NBC News anchor Chuck Todd basically says that this is a modern day Andrew Jackson in Donald Trump, that he doesn't really owe many people anything, and he's kind of here to do what he wants to do, so to speak. So what I would like for you to do is, you're listening to this screen recording, please write down any similarities that you know between, or that you notice between Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump. I know a lot of you have some good background knowledge on Donald Trump and his campaign, and now him becoming president, of course, and any similarities that you see between Jackson and Trump, I'd love for you to write those down, because I think it's really helpful in understanding who Jackson is. Talking a little bit about Jackson, some things that we've already learned about him previously in this class. Obviously, we've talked about his role as a general, specifically with the Battle of New Orleans during the War of 1812. Remember that Jackson is in New Orleans with his men. He's horribly outnumbered, and yet he still leads American troops to victory. So that's kind of how he gets a little bit famous within the United States. And then he also helps us to get Florida. If you remember, during his time as general, the United States military sends him down. The government gives him orders in southern Georgia to protect the border. And in typical Andrew Jackson fashion, he invades Florida instead. Even though he's not told to invade Florida, he figures, I can do it, and it'll work, and he was right. And once we took over Florida, we actually then negotiated with Spain to buy Florida for $5 million. So a couple of those things we've already talked about with Jackson in class already, and so we're just kind of adding to that as we go through things today. This guy right here is not Andrew Jackson. Some of you may recognize him from the show on television, Dirty Jobs. This is Mike Rowe. And Mike Rowe's show is all about common people in the United States who just have to do, dirty jobs in order to survive. And they're just kind of common people who are blue collar and trying to earn a living. And the first thing we're going to talk about with Jackson is his upbringing, how many people consider him to be just the common man president, meaning he doesn't really grow up with a whole lot. He doesn't have a lot going for him, yet he still rises to the highest level of authority in our country. Jackson is born in South Carolina in 1767. He was the first president born in a log cabin. I'm sure you've probably heard before about Abraham Lincoln being born in a log cabin, but it's actually Andrew Jackson who will be the first president um, that had that happen to him. Jackson's parents, when he was younger, were very poor. They didn't have a lot of money. What little money they did have, they used to send Andrew Jackson to a boarding school for him to get an education. The one good thing about Jackson's parents, despite them not having a lot of money, is they believed that education was the way for them to be able to help Andrew become successful, and Andrew saw that as well. Some of you might wonder, why are my teachers always on my case? Like, why is Mr. Bazem always telling me to get my work done? Well, no matter what type of family you come from, whether you come from the richest, most wealthy family or from the poorest family, an education is something that can really help you to become successful, which is why I'm always hounding you guys to do well in school and to do your best. And Andrew Jackson and his parents recognized that, and so even though Jackson didn't have a lot of money, his parents send him to go and get that education. If I haven't mentioned already, please make sure you're taking these notes down on either a Google Doc or pencil and paper, because you're going to be able to actually use these notes later on during this unit. You're actually going to have a writing test, and any notes that you take you will be able to use. So I want to make sure that this is as useful and helpful for you as possible. Jackson is going to be very similar to many of you in that he likes physical activities, he likes being outdoors. Andrew Jackson wasn't just someone who wanted to be cooped up inside all the time. So in a lot of ways, he could be compared with a lot of Central Montcalm students. Jackson was very confrontational, and he loved to get in fights when he was younger. So I'm sure that there are those of you listening to this that can probably relate to that a little bit as well. Jackson was very aggressive. Jackson didn't take being treated poorly by other people very well. He wasn't someone to turn the other cheek or to say sticks and stones can break my bones, words can never hurt me. If you said something about Jackson, if you treated Jackson poorly, he was going to fight you. And I don't just mean with words, I mean physically. He was going to, want to meet you after school and go and, try to beat you up. So, Andrew Jackson, a little bit of a wild upbringing in different ways. Talking about Jackson now as a teenager and young adult, about the time he was your age, 13, 14 years old, Jackson had already fought in the American Revolution. So here's a young man that, actually goes and fights in a war. Now, he wasn't as much a fighter, but he was a messenger. But yet he was still someone who saw combat. He was actually captured by the British. You'll be hearing more about that story when we watch the Jackson movie. But Jackson was actually in a war at age 13. He became an orphan at age 14. An orphan, if you're not aware, means that you have lost both of your parents. So it means you grow up without any parents. Not only did Jackson lose both of his parents, but he also lost both of his brothers. So by the time he was 14 years old, which I know is the age of a lot of our 8th graders, he had already fought in a war and lost both of his parents. So here's a young man with absolutely nothing going in his life. I mean, he's had a lot of hardship by the time he's your age. To Jackson's credit, though, he really educates himself and becomes a self-made man, meaning he doesn't use these things as an excuse. He doesn't use his time in war or the fact that he's an orphan. He doesn't let that deter him from becoming extremely successful. One of the things that I do like about Andrew Jackson is that he's a good example to all people that don't use things as an excuse. If you want to become something in your life, you can do it. Because Jackson had the deck stacked against him, with these things that we've already mentioned, yet he decides he needs an education, and he goes about and he gets it. He actually becomes a lawyer in Tennessee. He later makes money from his law profession and becomes a wealthy landowner. So he purchases land and owns a cotton plantation just outside of Nashville, Tennessee. On his plantation, he had over 100 African American slaves. Now, obviously, by today's standards, that's very wrong. We would obviously look down on someone who had slaves. But someone living in the South in the late 1700s, it was pretty common for you, if you were a wealthy landowner, to have a lot of slaves. So Jackson was a successful lawyer, he was a successful businessman, and we already talked about the fact that he'd fought in the war before, and he later becomes a general. I mentioned at the start of this PowerPoint how he helps us to win the Battle of New Orleans, he helps us to conquer Florida. So this is a guy who comes from nothing, is a real common man, yet rises to all this greatness and all of these impressive things. Um, Jackson wasn't someone who was born with a silver spoon in his mouth. His parents didn't have much money, but yet he was able to become very, very successful in a variety of ways. Obviously, in this unit, we're going to be talking about Jackson as president and a lot of his different policies. But I want to go through some of his political background that I want you to understand. One way that Jackson differs from Donald Trump, President Trump doesn't have, prior to becoming president, any political experience. His first job in politics is going to be president of the United States. Now, that is not true with Jackson. So some of you may have already written down or may already be thinking, well, one comparison between Jackson and Trump, they're both pretty aggressive individuals. And that might be something good to write down. But a difference is going to be this political background. Jackson starts becoming a politician at almost 30 years old in 1796 when he joins Congress as a member from Tennessee. He later becomes a state Supreme Court justice, a U.S. senator. You can see his time in the military would be right in this area. He later becomes the military governor of Florida once he takes it over. He helps to found the Democratic Party, the same Democratic Party we have today. You can see the symbol here of the goat. The goat, of course, is this. Sorry, not the goat. The donkey. Must not be my day here. My brain's getting a little fuzzy. But the donkey here is the symbol of the Democratic Party, and he founds that in 1828, and then he later becomes president for 8 years, from 1829 to 1837. And that's going to be a big thing that we'll be talking about with this unit, is what he does as president of the United States. Now, how does Jackson get elected? By the 1830s, about the time that Andrew Jackson was elected, more people were allowed to vote than ever before. The previous law stated that the only people allowed to vote in the United States were people who were white-skinned, you must have been a male, age 21 and up, and owned property. Now, around 1830, what the United States government did is it lifted the restriction of owning property. So now you only had to be a white male and 21 or older. More officials became elected in the United States instead of appointed. So you had more people in the United States able to vote, and now more officials were being elected, not just appointed to jobs. So the American people had a greater say in what was going on in their democracy. Presidential candidates were now selected by national conventions rather than congressional caucuses. What that means is these national conventions, you had more people with a say in government. The congressional caucuses, you had less people with a say in government and people just kind of appointing others to different positions. These new voters, I want you to consider, if you now don't have to own property, previously if the requirement was to own property, you were probably a pretty wealthy individual. Now you're getting more middle and lower class Americans invested and able to vote and become part of the American political system. So these middle and lower class Americans, they're not going to want to vote for these really rich people. They're not going to want to vote for these people whose parents have been rich and successful. They're going to want to vote for someone who's like them. They're going to want to vote for a common man. They're going to want to vote for someone who they believe will represent things that they want. And by this time, Andrew Jackson had become very popular. And so guess who all these common Americans voted for? Andrew Jackson, of course. You see one similarity maybe with Donald Trump in this, in that Trump was elected in large part by rural America. Places like Montcalm County got out and voted for Donald Trump in such huge numbers. Now, that's not the exact case with Jackson, but you kind of get the idea. Is this group of Americans really propelled both Jackson and Trump into the White House. Jackson's take on governing his time as president is often referred to as the Jacksonian Democracy. Andrew Jackson, not surprising based on the people who elected him, believed that middle and lower class Americans should have a say in what was going on in government. He believed that government shouldn't just be run by these really rich people whose parents and grandparents had always run it before. He believed that, people who knew what was going on, these middle class America, they should be able to have a say and be able to have a part in what's going on as representatives in the government. Jackson also believed in early term limits. In other words, he didn't want people to be in office for a long time without having to be reelected. He believed that the United States should continue to expand its territory. We obviously have already made the Louisiana Purchase. Lewis and Clark have went exploring out there. And now, in Jackson's mind, it was time to go and move out there and to expand and to create more states and to create more opportunities for people out west. Now, in a large sense, the people living out west during that time period were Native Americans. One thing I want you to keep in mind, Andrew Jackson didn't care about Native Americans. He didn't care if it impacted them. He was going to make the United States the best he thought it could be, and he was going to do that for American citizens, but not if you were Native American. If it hurt you, that didn't matter. Andrew Jackson wanted to help, the United States as he saw it, which didn't include Native Americans at all. Jackson was pro-slavery. He believed it helped the economy. Again, by today's standards, pretty awful way to think, but Jackson believed it was a good thing, especially in the South, because people in the South were making it rich. Remember, we talked about the cotton gin and how that really revolutionized the economy in the South, because now southern plantation owners, these farmers, could produce way more cotton, they could sell it, and they became very, very rich. Jackson kind of also starts something in the United States called the spoils system. And this has been in effect on and off in the United States ever since Andrew Jackson. Because Jackson was helped into the White House by a lot of common Americans, Jackson believed that since he became president, that his friends, the people that helped him to become president, they should be rewarded with government jobs. Not only as members of his cabinet, but Andrew Jackson went and fired a whole bunch of government officials and hired people that he liked better. He basically thought, well, if I'm approved as president, then that must mean you like me and everything I stand for and the people who support me. So anyone who doesn't support me, I'm going to fire them from their jobs at the national level, and I'm going to hire people who think like me and want things to be done like me. Some of you may have heard the saying before, to the victor goes the spoils. Well, the spoils means you get to hire anybody you want. Now, a lot of presidents do this same sort of thing. And a lot of people are interested to see, as Donald Trump takes over as president, will he have the same sort of system going on where he fires a whole bunch of public officials? I think we've all heard Donald Trump threaten at least to do those things as he was running for president of the United States. But we will see kind of what happens and see if he kind of implements a spoils system that is similar to Jackson. As I'm recording this in 2017, we don't know exactly what's going to happen yet, as Trump's going to take office on Friday, but it'll be interesting to see if that comparison holds true with Jackson. One of the big things that goes on during Jackson's time as president is something that happens with the National Bank of the United States. Under the National Bank, the U.S. government basically controlled most of citizens' money. So instead of having a whole bunch of different commercial and private banks like we have in the United States today, the banking system was more or less run by the U.S. government. Jackson didn't like that. In fact, he vetoed, meaning he rejected a bill to continue the national bank. Jackson wanted to get rid of it. Why? Well, again, think about Jackson's upbringing. Jackson felt that the national bank really favored just wealthy people and denied common people equal economic opportunity. In other words, the rich were just going to get richer with the national bank. Since there weren't very many options for banking, the same people who had always been wealthy were going to continue to be wealthy. And if interest rates weren't good, or if people couldn't get the loans that they wanted to, they didn't have a lot of opportunities to go to different banks. And so Jackson didn't like the national bank, and so with him vetoing it, he basically helps to get rid of it. And in doing so, this leads to the formation of banks like we have them today, commercial private banks. Think about it this way. In our area, we have Chemical Bank, Isabella Bank. You go more to the Greenville area, you might see Fifth Third, Bank of America, Comerica. There are a whole bunch of different banks that if you want to go get a loan, you can choose to go to any one of these different ones. You can look at interest rates. You can look at the types of loans that they'll give you, the types of investments you can make in certain banks. So there's a lot of competition in commercial and private banks. And that wasn't the case when we had a national bank. And Andrew Jackson thought that that was wrong. Once people could pull their money out of the national bank, once it no longer existed, people invested their money in different ways, and the economy really started to take off. Now new banks started to spring up, and people could get all sorts of different interest rates and loans and lots of different possibilities. In fact, a lot of Jackson's friends were pretty intelligent and started up their own banks, and they made it filthy rich. So kind of interesting how Jackson doesn't want to favor the wealthy people, but his own pals kind of benefited off of this whole thing happening. The government also was making money from taxes and also selling government-owned land. Part of the land owned in the Louisiana Purchase, Andrew Jackson thought, well, if I want people to expand out there, we should sell people land. And now that they have more control of their own money, if they want to invest in that land, that's good for people to start spending money. It's good for the government. It keeps money in the economy. And it also is going to help people to expand out west. So Jackson's idea here with the National Bank, although it wasn't favored by everyone during that era, it ended up being a pretty good move in the eyes of a lot of historians. What's really neat about Andrew Jackson, you see him pictured here on the $20 bill, and we'll talk later this year about how Jackson's really being phased out of the $20 bill, and actually I believe he's going to be replaced. So we'll talk more about that process. But Jackson is the only president in the history of the United States to pay off the national debt. If you don't know what the national debt is, it's where the United States owes money to different countries, to different groups around the world, and we actually owe money. Like your parents or my wife and I, we might owe money on a car or a home or a mortgage or something like that. You know, we still have money, but we owe more money than what we've paid. And that's what the national debt is. Jackson is the only president in the history, over 200 years in the United States, to pay off the national debt in full. And so that's kind of a neat thing for him to be able to brag about. If you're curious why I have this little monopoly picture here, that's really what the National Bank had. It was a monopoly, meaning they owned it was just one bank. Now that doesn't mean one physical bank, but it means only one branch throughout the United States. And so, they had all control of the entire banking system, which Jackson believed was horribly unfair. Another major problem during Jackson's tenure was tariff problems, specifically with the state of South Carolina. A tariff is a tax on imports. That's one of those vocabulary terms I want you to be familiar with as we study this unit. The state of South Carolina did not like paying certain tariffs. There were these tax on imports that as South Carolina got goods in from the Atlantic Ocean, they had to pay taxes to the United States government. They decided to nullify, meaning they refused to pay some of those tariffs. In other words, South Carolina basically said, well, we don't like this system. We don't like the fact that we got to pay these taxes, so we ain't going to pay them. And, even though the federal law was that they must do that, they said, nah, to heck with that. We ain't paying these tariffs. They're a ripoff, and they're going to hurt our economy. They're going to hurt our ability to trade. We ain't going to do it. So you might wonder, okay, well, if Mr. Bazem, if I decide not to pay my taxes, yeah, I'm going to get in trouble. But imagine this at a state level. Imagine an entire state in the United States goes, yeah, we're not paying our taxes. This is going to cause some problems. What's interesting is Jackson's vice president at the time, a guy named John C. Calhoun, this guy with the awesome poodle hair that I'm sure many of you will want to sport. You guys out there, maybe go to your local barber and just ask for the John C. Calhoun hairdo. Anyway, John C. Calhoun, who is Jackson's vice president, he actually supported South Carolina. He basically said, if you don't want to pay those taxes, then don't do it. I respect your right as a state to refuse to do that. Now, this led to huge debates in the United States Congress, and Congressman by the name of Daniel Webster, this fabulous fellow here, he basically said, and he's right, that according to the Constitution, states can't just refuse to pay taxes they don't like. Just like I can't refuse to pay taxes I don't like, I'm going to get in trouble for that. I'm going to go to jail. I'm going to have to pay fines. The government's not going to be happy with me. And people began to wonder, well, if Congress kind of says one thing and the vice president says another, what does President Andrew Jackson think? Andrew Jackson agreed with Daniel Webster. He thought that South Carolina should have to pay the tariffs. Their taxes, you have to pay them. It's a law in the United States and you will do it. Jackson and his vice president at the time, Calhoun, got in a huge argument about this. Calhoun thought that states should have their own rights. He thought South Carolina should be able to make their own choice. Jackson believed in national sovereignty. In other words, what the Constitution says, what the laws say, you must follow. Whether you're a citizen or whether you're a state, that must happen. John C. Calhoun actually resigns as vice president of the United States. So Andrew Jackson has a vice president quit during his presidency. Now, some people say that John C. Calhoun voluntarily resigned. Other historians will tell you that Jackson was going to fire him, and so he quit before Jackson could do it. Jackson, quite the hot-tempered individual, which is another comparison some of you might be making with President Trump. Martin Van Buren is going to become the new vice president of the United States, and he tended to agree a lot more with things that Andrew Jackson said and did. Sometimes it's a good idea to agree with Andrew Jackson if you want to stay on his good side. What happens is, with this entire thing, is a force bill is passed in 1832, which basically authorized the United States military to go to South Carolina and enforce the tariffs. Basically say, we're bringing the military in, and they're going to make you pay the taxes, or else. Now, South Carolina was not very impressed with the force bill, and they threatened to secede, meaning they threatened to leave the United States. They threatened to say, well, we're not going to do that, and we'll fight you on it, and we'll just become our own country. Now, as crazy as that sounds, that's what South Carolina threatened to do. What ends up happening, there was a compromise tariff reached where the taxes were lowered, South Carolina agreed to pay them, and they decided not to withdraw from the United States. At least not yet. When we get to the Civil War and our unit on that, South Carolina decides maybe to do things a little differently. One of the biggest things Jackson does in his presidency, I already talked with you about one of the expectations, and this is your last long slide, I promise you. One of the biggest things Jackson does, and this is one of the key points that you're going to need to understand with this entire unit, is his treatment of Native Americans, or his policies' impact on Native Americans. Andrew Jackson believed, as I said earlier, that we should expand the United States. We have the Louisiana Territory. Lewis and Clark have went exploring. We have this land to sell. We're going to sell it. People are going to move out west. It's going to expand the United States, and it's going to be great for everyone. As white settlers continue to move west, though, Native Americans and the tensions with white Americans began to get more heated, especially when gold was discovered in the northern part of Georgia, which was controlled by the Cherokee Indians. As you might suspect, white settlers, upon learning there was gold in northern Georgia, they started invading these Native American lands and basically taking land, taking gold as they saw fit. Now, the Cherokee Indians said, you couldn't do this. And so they contacted President Jackson and the military and said, please stop this. This is our land. We have been here for hundreds of years, and you can't just come into our land and claim it as your own and steal our gold. Andrew Jackson did nothing. He ignored the Cherokees, turned the other way, refused to listen. Andrew Jackson didn't care for Native Americans. He didn't care that they'd been there for hundreds of years. He didn't care that they discovered gold and that we were taking it. To Jackson, he basically kind of encouraged white Americans to go and take land and take gold for their own because that was going to help the United States. In Jackson's mind, Native Americans weren't part of the United States, so they were the enemy. Getting no results from Andrew Jackson, the Cherokee Indians sued for the right to stay on their own land. And the case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court. At the United States Supreme Court level, the Cherokee Indians won. The United States Supreme Court ordered for these white Americans who were invading native territories to basically get out and to leave the land free for Native Americans. So the Supreme Court ruled that this must happen. The white Americans must move out. Now it's President Jackson's job to enforce the ruling of the Supreme Court. He ignored it. Now some of you might be sitting here going, shouldn't he be impeached? Shouldn't he be getting in trouble? If the Supreme Court says something, doesn't the president have to enforce it? Yes, the president must. That is part of the president's job, is to do what the Supreme Court tells him to do and enforce the laws. Jackson didn't do it. Even more remarkably, he wasn't punished. Why wasn't he punished? people were afraid of Andrew Jackson. Jackson was really well liked. The man could kind of do whatever he wanted to do. Some of you might be looking at the comparisons between Jackson and Trump going, well, Jackson wasn't very nice to the Native Americans. Kind of like how Trump has, threatened to deport people who weren't born in the United States, these illegal aliens, or build the wall with Mexico. And so you see kind of these same tensions with different racial groups or different groups of people. Jackson thought that the Cherokee Indians might retaliate and start fighting these white settlers. So instead of just ignoring the ruling and allowing white America to kind of do what they wanted to do, Jackson, he really gets pretty vicious, and he relocates the Native Americans. The Indian Removal Act, passed in the 1830s, takes a total of 125,000 Native Americans who were living east of the Mississippi, and according to this legislation, according to this law that Jackson helps get passed, these 125,000 Native Americans living east of the Mississippi are forced off their lands onto lands west of the Mississippi called reservations. In 1838, this removal process begins. Cherokee Indians, among various other native tribes, were forced west of the Mississippi to areas of present-day Oklahoma. This area that they moved them to was some of the worst farmland in the entire country. They basically relocated these natives to another part of the country that we didn't want. Now, you might be saying, well, what if Native Americans didn't go? Well, the United States military, the Army, basically forced them to go. And if they refused, there was going to be a war. Tragically, 25% of these 125,000 Native Americans died along the trail. Now, the exact numbers aren't completely known, but that's somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 Americans died during this event. Now, students, you're going to hear I've got a little buddy with me here who happened to walk in the room as I was finishing up with this. So, Hunter, are we going to help the kids with the rest of their PowerPoint? Yes? Can you say hi, kids?
Hi, kids.
All right, so Hunter and I are going to finish up with you here. So 25% of these Native Americans died along the Trail of Tears. You have 20 to 30,000 that died. This event becomes known as the Trail of Tears because obviously it was this very tragic journey where people are walking, these natives are walking hundreds of miles, and they're being killed. One last thing with Jackson and the Native Americans was something that happened in Florida. There were Native Americans who were fighting for their land, these Seminole Indians. Many of them escaped to the Everglades in South Florida, but they were eventually defeated by Jackson's army. Basically, if you were a Native American group and you were trying to fight for your land, Andrew Jackson was going to fight you or remove you or basically make you non-existent. And some of you might be wondering, how could the United States government allow this to happen? Well, Congress passed it. Again, Jackson was a very popular president. Some of you might say, well, why didn't the Supreme Court stick up for these horrible things going on? People were afraid of Jackson. So, some of these acts passed by Jackson were pretty drastic, but kind of interesting to learn how all this happens. My wife and I, before little Hunter here was born, we actually took a trip to Nashville, Tennessee, and we stopped at the home of Andrew Jackson, which is called the Hermitage. Here you can see the sign as we were pulling in. This right here is Andrew Jackson's mansion, and these two pictures, along with this one, this is the area where Jackson and his wife Rachel are buried. If you look at this tombstone, and I know you can't read it, this is actually the tomb of Andrew Jackson, and so that is where he is buried. This picture right here, one of these swords, if I can bring this back up for you, I believe it's this sword right here, was a sword that Andrew Jackson used during the Battle of New Orleans. And so you can see it's this really long sword that Jackson used against his enemies. And I thought that was kind of neat that they had this displayed in the Hermitage. One neat thing that my wife and I found out about Jackson is we were talking with one of the workers here at the Hermitage, was that Jackson only had half of his house painted. He only had the front side painted by a group of slaves, and when they went to ask him, hey, we need more paint for the back side of the house, he basically said, I don't care about that. Just make sure everyone comes through the front side so they see the best part of the house. So President Jackson, evidently, we talked about him repaying the national debt. He was a bit of a cheapskate, must be. Buddy, we're almost done. We're going to help the kids with this last slide, and then we'll be all set, okay? Some similarities between Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump. Now that you've heard this entire presentation, I want you to take a few minutes to make sure that you have some similarities jotted down between both Jackson and Trump. I'll tell you what, buddy, we're going to turn your Paw Patrol dogs on in just a second. We just got to finish up with the kids, okay? So I want you to list as many similarities as you can between Donald Trump and Andrew Jackson, and feel free to talk with the person next to you about this. This could be personality characteristics, this could be policies that the two politicians had, it could be background information, so how they grew up, their treatment of certain political groups or racial groups or groups of Americans, and be prepared to share these with the class when I return. So I think you'll see there are a lot of interesting comparisons to be made between Andrew Jackson and Donald Trump. Last thing I'd like for you to do, if you go to Google Classroom, before you leave today, I would like you to please fill out your exit ticket for Andrew Jackson. All this is basically 5 questions that are going to test whether or not you learned what I was hopeful that you would today. And if you would take that, that will really help me to figure out where we're going with the rest of this unit. We'll talk more about Andrew Jackson when I return. We're actually going to be getting going in the next few days with a movie on Jackson. So thank you all very much for your attention, and I hope you've got some good notes that you'll be able to use for the test. Any questions, make sure you ask me when I'm back. Thanks.